Welcome to Dig, a history podcast.
In 1923, a Dakota woman named Zitkala-Ša wrote the first draft of an essay that she labeled Our Sioux People. The essay was ultimately never published, but in her manuscript, Zitkala-Ša traces the history of the United States government's relationship with what she refers to as the Sioux. She tells the story of several delegates from the Pine Ridge Reservation traveling to Washington, D.C. to meet with representatives of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. After an arduous journey, they were brought into the office of Mr. E.B. Merritt, who listened, implacable, to the visiting Indians. Zitkala-Ša described the scene thus, quote, "Through all the pathos of their sad story, the sight of their gaunt faces, their cheap and shabby civilian clothes, which bespoke their poverty more than their words, Mr. E.B. Merritt, Assistant Commissioner, sat unmoved in his luxurious office, where walls were hung with bright colored paintings of primitive Indian folks and their teepees."
The contrast between the impoverished and suffering delegation from the Pine Ridge Reservation and the lavish government office decorated with paintings of Indians captured something of the relationship between the Indian and the U.S. federal government. Zitkala-Ša, a sharp activist and skilled writer, compared this paradox to an old Sioux legend. Quote, "There's an old Sioux legend about Doubleface, a creature that had a face on both front and back of his head. It's told of him that he stole an Indian baby, and when the child cried from hunger, he sang a lullaby to it, while switching its little bare feet with a thorny rose bush." End quote.
The Sioux, and by extension all Native Americans, were the baby in this metaphor, held by the paternalistic federal government, continuously inflicting the very pain that it then shushed and quieted. Zitkala-Ša compared Doubleface to the evil slaver Simon Legree of the famous 19th century novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, who whipped the people he enslaved, quote, "till their lacerated bodies were covered with blood." At least Legree, she argued, was, quote, frank in his brutality and did not try to deceive by any pretense of humanitarianism. His face was single and not double.
Zitkala-Ša knew intimately the tension that came from the American doubleface. When she was a child, she was recruited to attend a school run by missionaries in Indiana, and from that moment onward, spent the rest of her life caught between Sioux culture and Anglo-American culture. She had two names, a Lakota name, Zitkala-Ša, and her American name, Gertrude Bonin. Zitkala-Ša developed a talent for writing, which she used to describe in powerful detail the plight of the American Indian in the late 19th and early 20th century, and to further her political activism. In 1926, she became a co-founder of the National Council of American Indians, an activist lobbying group intended to advocate for Indian citizenship and voting rights. She served as the president of the group until her death in 1938. She was also a women's rights activist and an active member of the General Federation of Women's Clubs, and went on a cross-country speaking tour on behalf of the organization, during which she called for the abolition of the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
In this series, we're exploring issues and topics that extend and complement our beloved Elizabeth Mazurek's fantastic new book, The Sentimental State. Today, I want to talk more about one woman whose complex political writing and activism added the perspectives of American Indians to women's political activism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Gertrude Bonin, also known by her Dakota Lakota name, Zitkala-Ša. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Marissa.
And we are your historians for this episode of Dig.
We want to thank all of our Patreon supporters and especially our fabulous auger and excavator level patrons. Lisa, Carl, Karen, Hannah, Jessica, Maria, Denise, Edward, Lauren, Colin, and Susan. We can't thank you enough. Listener, if you're not yet a patron of this show, it's easy. Just go to patreon.com/digpodcast to learn more.
I first encountered Zitkala-Ša when we were working on our book, Spiritualism's Place. As you might recall, because we talked about this in previous episodes, I wrote a chapter on how spiritualism and New Age religion appropriate Native American spirituality. But within that chapter, I was also trying to unravel a little mystery about two Indian people that are claimed by Lilydale as important figures in their past, Askinantan and Princess Chinquilla. They were singing partners, traveling around to communities like Lilydale, performing operatic music and delivering lectures during the 19-teens. But while I was able to learn eventually, after a lot of digging, quite a bit about Askinantan's life. For instance, he was born in Ontario, Canada. He was a Mohawk. He became an opera singer as a young man. He traveled around the United States and Europe performing. I mean, you can read much more about this in our book. But I was never really able to pin down much about Chinquilla. She claimed that she was a princess, and she usually identified herself as Cheyenne. But after she started performing with Askinantan, she said she was Mohawk, or that she was half Mohawk. In my own quest to unravel this little mystery, I happened upon a really interesting article by a scholar of Native American studies named Carrie Carpenter, which was about Zitkala-Ša's quest to also unravel the mystery of Princess Chinquilla.
Zitkala-Ša and Charlotte Jones, an acquaintance that she met through her work with the National Council of American Indians, which we're going to just refer to as NCAI, were suspicious of Chinquilla. In the 1920s, Chinquilla had a fairly high profile, and Zitkala-Ša had invited her to join the NCAI. But when Chinquilla aligned herself with another activist named Red Fox James, who many also suspected of being an imposter, Zitkala-Ša, her husband Raymond Bonin, and their acquaintance Charlotte Jones began an unofficial investigation into Chinquilla's background. They were especially concerned with exposing fake Indians because, as Raymond Bonin described it, quote, if she really is one of them, meaning Cheyenne, she would inform herself better as to their needs and try honestly to work for their benefit. For anybody to fool the people like this only makes it harder for real Indians to help their own people, for everybody to get suspicious of them too, end quote.
Scholar Carrie Carpenter, in her article that explores this debate over Chinquilla's quote-unquote Indianness, isn't actually interested in whether or not Chinquilla was really Cheyenne or Native American at all. And again, that's something that I sort of talk about in the book, if you're interested in that question. Instead, she examines how, in their quest to unmask Chinquilla, Zitkala-Ša, her husband Raymond, and Charlotte Jones all debate what it actually meant to be Indian in the early 20th century. Charlotte Jones, for instance, grapples with her own identity in a letter to Zitkala-Ša from 1927, writing, I am of mixed blood, white and Indian. In what proportion, I do not know, but the greater part is Indian. My ancestors were Delaware or Lenni Lenape from Maryland and that vicinity. They are now mostly scattered as a tribe and very much mixed. The white blood is in part Irish. I do not think the amount of white blood is sufficient to limit my membership, as I'm pretty sure that is less than 1/3. You can sort of hear there that Charlotte Jones is not totally certain of her Indianness, right? She's not actually sure of what today we would call her blood quantum. Zitkala-Ša also accused Chinquilla of masquerading as an Indian while quote-unquote made up or wearing inauthentic Indian dress. In 1927, Zitkala-Ša speculated to Jones that something was off in Chinquilla's appearance, writing, quote, her pictures in Indian dress are not right. And as I remember from that momentary meeting over a year ago, side note, she had met Chinquilla at a gathering, I believe she painted her face all over with some kind of stuff, attempting to copy the Indian complexion, for I remarked to Captain Bonin that Chinquilla has a most peculiar yellowish color, and that her eyes didn't look right. They weren't black or brown. She wore beads and colors that night that seemed to be a labored effort to appear Indian. It was not natural.
But as scholars have demonstrated throughout her career, Zitkala-Ša herself played with her presentation, especially when it was useful in performances before white people. a talented musician, Zitkala-Ša had been invited to perform a piano recital at a white church in California, with the specific request that she wear Indian dress. She explained to her friend, the archaeologist Arthur C. Parker, who was Seneca, quote, "No doubt there may be some who may not wholly approve of the Indian dress. I hope it does not displease you. Even a clown has to dress differently from his usual citizen suit," end quote. Early in her life, Zitkala-Ša had been a model for photographer Gertrude Kayserbier, posing wearing clothing that historian Tadeusz Lewandowski characterized as mock Indian garb.
We start with the story instead of at the beginning of Zitkala-Ša's life because it not only explains my own interest in her, like how I became kind of fascinated with this woman, but also because it serves as a really interesting introduction to Zitkala-Ša's complex life, her complex activism, and her complex decisions. Zitkala-Ša lived through a tremendously difficult, complicated, and eventful era in American Indian history. The fact that she was skeptical of Chinquilla's authenticity when she knew that she had also at times worn inauthentic, quote unquote, inauthentic clothing is illustrative of just how in flux the concept of Indianness was during this era. Zitkala-Ša was born in 1876, the last child of her mother, Tate Yohin Win, sometimes translated as Reaches for the Wind or Every Wind. Tate Yohin Win was Yankton, Dakota.
Let's take a time out for a minute to talk about terminology. The names Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota all refer to language dialects used by peoples who historically lived in the area that we now call Wyoming, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, and Colorado. This larger group is sometimes called Oceti-Sakowin, which means people of the 7 council fires. But, like using the term Six Nations to refer to the Haudenosaunee, this is a term that is specific to a moment in time. Before the formation of this larger organization, that name isn't quite accurate. The Oceti-Sakowin is much more commonly known as the Sioux, which is the name first used by the French, based on the words that other tribes, specifically the Ojibwe, used for them. Now, many use either the term Dakota or Lakota to refer to the overarching tribe. Following the example of the scholars we consulted, we're going to use the term Dakota to refer to the tribe as a unit, but we'll use Sioux when the historical actors themselves use that term. Further, the Dakota consist of multiple regional bands, such as the Santee, Yankton, Oglala, Blackfeet, Miniconjou, and others. Also, we're choosing to use Zitkala-Ša's Dakota name for most of the episode. She was also named Gertrude Simmons and Gertrude Bonin, but when she published, she chose to use her Dakota name, so that's what we'll use too.
So just a note here, because this is actually even more complicated. Like, this is already complicated, but it's like actually her naming is even a little bit more complicated. Her mother named her Gertrude Simmons. Like, that was her name. She, as I understand it, named herself Zitkala-Ša later in her life. And then she goes through periods of identifying as Zitkala-Ša and then periods of identifying as Gertrude Bonin. In like her own correspondence, she typically refers to herself as Mrs. Bonin. But then at other times, she signs or she signs her writing or she publishes under the name Zitkala-Ša. But that like changes over time. So it seems as though she chose the name Zitkala-Ša, which translates to red bird, for like political reasons. Like she wanted it very clear that what she had published was published by an Indian woman, rather than using her American name, Gertrude Simmons. So we're just going to use Zitkala-Ša here because that seems to be the name that she wanted to be known as in her public-facing life. That's a decision we're making, and other scholars may make other decisions regarding how they refer to her. Tate Yohin Win was Yankton, Dakota, born sometime between 1820 and 1830. She married several times. First to a French fur trader named Pierre St. Pierre, which makes me laugh.
It's so French.
I know. The two lived in a community of other fur traders, many of whom also had Yankton wives. Pierre St. Pierre died in 1853, leaving Tate y Johan Wynne with their two young sons. Seeking refuge, she went to live with her brother. She remarried in 1858, this time to an Anglo-American man named John Hastings Simmons. During the intervening period, like when she was unmarried, the Yankton, under significant pressure, signed over 11.5 million acres of land for 30 cents an acre in what had just become the state of Minnesota, and in doing so agreed to live on a reservation. Without access to this previously vast hunting ground, the Dakota relied on payments for the land in order to survive, payments that often didn't arrive or arrived late. After her marriage, Tate y Johan Wynne started to use the Anglo-American name Ellen Simmons. The couple had several more children until John Simmons' death in 1874. Again, Tate y Johan Wynne had to rely on her brother for support, but by now it was very hard to live independently on the reservation land without the ability to hunt sufficiently to support a family, right? So even moving in with her brother isn't sufficient because he can't actually support them. He can't support himself, really. So they were forced to move to the Yankton Indian Agency in the town of Greenwood in the Dakota Territory. Now, agencies were kind of like embassies. They served as the headquarters for the United States government, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs, to be more specific, in Indian territories, and they acted as the main point of contact for Indians, between Indians and the federal government, essentially, in those areas. As a result of the journey to the agency, Tate y Johan Wynne's youngest child, a little girl, died of exhaustion and illness. Not long after that, one of her sons also died. 2 years later, in 1876, Tate y Johan Wynne had remarried briefly, this time to another French man who doesn't stay in the picture for very long, and gave birth to another daughter, Zitkala-Ša, who she gave the English name Gertrude Simmons.
Zitkala-Ša's family was scattered. Sometime before her birth, her French father took off, never to be heard from again. Then her older half-brother David went away to boarding school at a missionary school in Nebraska, followed by study at Hampton Institute, now the HBCU Hampton University, which accepted Indians. Things weren't easy. Zitkala-Ša and her mother relied on the rations distributed by the agency to survive, but Zitkala-Ša recalled these days as wonderful and loving. She wasn't just raised by her mother, but by the elders in the Yankton community, as well as an extended kin network. She began attending a bilingual school at the agency at the age of 6, and 2 years later, missionaries came to the agency looking for children to take back to their Quaker missionary school in Indiana. Tate y Johan Wynne wasn't thrilled about the idea. She had a little reason to trust white people, as you can imagine, and while she'd let her son go off to school, she likely had very different gendered reservations about sending away her daughter. But as Zitkala-Ša's biographer Tadeusz Lewandowski writes, quote, Ellen Simmons, aware that the future looked increasingly dismal, decided to relinquish her daughter temporarily in the hope that it would enable the girl's survival, end quote. Zitkala-Ša was excited to attend the school, which she'd been told was surrounded by apple trees. But in short order, she realized the school was not what she had hoped.
At the Quaker school, the teachers used cruel physical discipline. They cut off the children's long braids, instead requiring that they wear their hair in acceptable American styles. The facilities were dirty and the food was scarce, leaving children weak and sick. The curriculum reinforced American cultural ideals, including gender roles in which men did farm work and women kept clean, moral homes and raised children. Students were strongly encouraged to convert to Christianity and let go of their culture. Zitkala-Ša returned home at 11 after finishing the course of study at the Quaker school. She then bounced around between a couple of different schools, sometimes living back at home in Yankton, but as she became a teenager, it was increasingly difficult for her to live at the agency. She was now experiencing a tension between the Americanized life she had had while at school and the Dakota life that she had at home, and felt caught between two worlds. She eventually returned back to White's, the Quaker school, and became a favorite pupil. A Quaker woman recognized her musical talents and fostered them in singing, violin, and piano. Eventually, she was actually used in recruiting more students to the school, something that she does throughout her education, including a fellow Yankton boy named Raymond Telefaus Bonin, who was the man destined to later become her husband. She actually is involved in recruiting him to the school. He's like 5 or 6 years younger than her. When the school had to lay off staff, she then became a teacher and an administrator. In 1895, she was invited to be the year's commencement speaker, and she delivered a speech entitled The Progress of Women about the need for women's rights.
In 1895, Zitkala-Ša was accepted to Earlham College, a small Quaker college in Richmond, Indiana. Her mother wasn't happy, hoping instead that Zitkala-Ša would return home and live with her at the Yankton Agency. But Zitkala-Ša was eager for a new life, continuing her education and studying music. She's an active student, earning high grades, performing recitals, and joining clubs. In 1896, Zitkala-Ša was invited to participate in a multi-college oratory contest. When she entered the hall in Indianapolis, some of the students from Butler College had hung their banners from the upper balcony, decorated with images intended to embarrass and enrage their competition. The Earlham banner was decorated with a caricature of an Indian woman. She later wrote it was meant to be a squaw, with the word humility under it. While the other speakers gave their orations, they extolled Christianity and American democracy. Then Zitkala-Ša, going by Gertrude Bonin, rose to speak. Her speech, called Side by Side, railed against the invasion of North America by Europeans and criticized the suggestions that Indians were savages. Quote, "The charge of cruelty has been brought against the Indian, but the white man has been witness and the judge. Anglo-Saxon England, with its progressive blood, its long-continued development of freedom and justice, its 8 centuries of Christian training, burned the writhing martyr in the fires of Kenneth Field. Let it be remembered before condemnation is passed upon the red man that while he burned and tortured frontiersmen, Puritan Boston burned witches and hanged Quakers, and the Southern aristocrat beat his slaves and set bloodhounds on the tracks of him who dared aspire to freedom." End quote. I just want to say that sick there, because no witches were burned in America. They were all hanged.
Well, yeah, they weren't witches, first of all. But also, one guy was crushed and the rest of them were what, hung?
Hanged, yeah. But that is a common misconception. But I just didn't want to let that go unnoted. My early modern is showing.
She went on to criticize the idea of the quote-unquote disappearing Indian and explained that signs of Indian savagery were the results of quote-unquote civilization. And her quote goes like this: "Civilization is not an unmixed blessing. Vices begin to creep into his life and deepen the red man's degradation. He learns to crave the European liquid fire. Broken treaties shake his faith in the newcomers. Continued aggressions goad him to desperation. The white man's bullet decimates his tribes and drive him from his home. What if he fought? His forests were felled, his game frightened away, his streams of finny shoals usurped. He loved his family and would defend them. He loved the fair land which he was the rightful owner. He loved the inheritance of his fathers, their traditions, their graves. He held them a priceless legacy to be sacredly kept. He loved his native land. Do you wonder still that in his breast he should brood revenge? Is patriotism a virtue only in Saxon hearts?" I mean, that goes really hard for a speech from 1896.
Yeah, geez.
It's incredible.
Right.
Reflecting ideas of racial uplift common in Black political circles in the late 19th century, Zitkala-Ša ended the essay by saying that Indians were, quote, seeking the white man's ways. With assistance, what she calls the, quote, warm hand of friendship, Native Americans could stand side by side with white Americans, quote, ascribing royal honor to our nation's flag. America, I love thee. And then she finished with a quote from the biblical book of Ruth, quote, "Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God."
The speech was a huge hit. Ultimately, she placed second, thwarted by the Southern judge who was insulted at her depictions of enslavement. The speech was powerful in its criticism of white Americans' treatment of Indians, but also ended the speech on an assimilationist note. This reflected her own experience, deeply affected by the mistreatment of Native people, but also invested in living a life assimilated into white society. The oratory contest itself was an example of that. The sole Indian woman standing in an auditorium full of white people, mostly men, who objectified and mocked her, railed against their mistreatment, while also trying to get into the club by winning the contest. But while she was highly praised at Earlham, Zitkala-Ša left early, partly because of a long illness and partly because she needed to start supporting herself financially. Instead of going home to Yankton in 1897, the 21-year-old Zitkala-Ša traveled to Pennsylvania to become a teacher at the Carlisle Indian School.
The Carlisle Indian School wasn't the only boarding school dedicated to the education of Native Americans, but it was probably one of the most well-known. Located in a decommissioned U.S. Army barracks in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and founded by Richard Henry Pratt in 1879, the school was federally funded and dedicated explicitly to the cultural assimilation of American Indians. Early experience educating imprisoned Indians in St. Augustine, Florida, had convinced Pratt that Indians could be assimilated into American society with strict classical, moral, and cultural education. A typical explanation of Carlisle's mission was summed up in the school magazine, The Indian Helper, in 1898, like this, quote, "It is this nature in our red brother that is better dead than alive. And when we agree with the oft-repeated sentiment that the only good Indian is a dead one, we mean this characteristic of the Indian. Carlisle's mission is to kill this Indian as we build up the better man." Just pausing there to acknowledge that sucks. And it's a horrible quote, but it's also a quote that is sums up exactly what the mission of Carlisle was, right? To sort of kill the Indian in the person and allow sort of the Christian American to emerge. Carlisle teachers enforced very strict rules. Children were disallowed from speaking their own languages. They were forced to cut their long hair and wear it in American styles. They had to wear American clothing and become Christians. The content of their education constantly reinforced the notion that their cultures were inferior, immoral, and a barrier to progress. For Indian girls, like Zitkala-Ša, they were trained specifically to become Victorian American housewives, rejecting the quote-unquote wanton sexuality that white Americans believed Native women possessed. When she arrived at Carlisle, the slim, lovely, and cultured Zitkala-Ša seemed like living proof of the success of this process.
Zitkala-Ša was used almost immediately in recruiting students to Carlisle and was sent back to Yankton for that purpose. She found her mother living in abject poverty and the reservation windowed down as a result of the Dawes Act, which gave land allotments to each head of household and relinquished the rest to white American settlers. She returned to Carlisle distressed about life at home in Yankton. She continued to study music, write, and deliver speeches while teaching at Carlisle. Around this time, she met a woman named Gertrude Kayserbier, who was a celebrated photographer, likely the best-known woman photographer of the day. Kayserbier was interested in Indian subjects, and around the time she met Zitkala-Ša, she spent time with Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show to photograph many of the Plains Indians who traveled with the troupe. In 1898, Kayserbier arranged to photograph Zitkala-Ša along with her friend, photographer Joseph Kiley. The pair took a number of photographs of the 22-year-old woman, in most of them wearing mock native garb and draped with beads. In one taken by Kiley, she leans back on the couch, staring off to the side. Her very long black hair is shiny and flows over her shoulders. One hand is gently touching her hair, and the other rests in her lap, decorated with rings.
When I was first learning about Zitkala-Ša, I came across these photographs, and they are truly breathtaking. She looks striking and powerful. She takes up a lot of physical space within the image. Her body is posed in ways that would have been considered unladylike, maybe even downright masculine, right? In one of them, she's like looking out, looking like off to the side, and she has her hand over her eyes, like in this almost like stereotypical sort of Native American like scouting stance. But she just like, she looks very powerful and in command of the situation. It doesn't look like an image that was manipulated by a white person to kind of create an effect. I mean, of course, the people who are photographing her are white Americans. But the effect of these photographs is really incredible. I will try to embed some of them in the show notes, but they are very, very worth seeing. And one of the things that I found striking as I was, spending a lot of time kind of meditating on her life, writing this, is just how actually rare it is for us to see images of women from history that weren't wealthy and white, right? And she was very well photographed later in her life because she was well known and a political figure, but like the images that we get of her are simply a quirk result, like a contingent result of the fact that she meets this woman photographer who takes her on as a subject. I just think that that's really incredible.
Mm-hmm. I agree. So during this time, Zitkala-Ša was living in Boston, continuing study of the violin privately with the Austrian violinist Eugene Gruenberg. Gertrude Kaiserbier encouraged her to apply to the New England Conservatory of Music, where Gruenberg was on the faculty. She never made it into the school. While she was in Boston, Zitkala-Ša learned that her fiancé, a Yankton man named Thomas Marshall, who she had attended the Quaker school with and who studied at Dickinson College in Carlisle, had died suddenly of measles. Biographer Tadeusz Lewandowski speculates that it was this experience, feeling disconnected in the East Coast city, losing her fiancé, that sparked her desire to process her thoughts about Indian life in writing. Through her connection to Gertrude Kaiserbier, Zitkala-Ša met Joseph Edgar Chamberlain, a successful New England journalist who welcomed her to his home so she could write and then encouraged the editor of the Atlantic Monthly to read her submissions. The result was a series of essays published in the Atlantic in 1900, when Zitkala-Ša was 24. It was in the byline of these essays that she first used her Dakota name, Zitkala-Ša, professionally instead of Gertrude Bonin.
Zitkala-Ša was a sharp and incisive writer, channeling the strong criticism of her speech side by side. Her first essays for The Atlantic explored her childhood on the Yankton Reservation and skewered the boarding school system of Indian education. Rather than simply criticizing the system, she explicitly connected the realities of boarding schools to her own experiences. Her essay, The School Days of an Indian Girl, is a semi-autobiographical account of her experience at the Quaker school. In it, Zitkala-Ša describes the long train ride to the Quaker school in Indiana. Then, she recalled that when she arrived, a white woman playfully tossed her into the air. Quote, "My mother had never made a plaything of her wee daughter," describing her sense of cultural alienation. Later, she wrote that she was dragged out from a hiding place and tied to a chair while her braids were cut off. She was alone and isolated. Quote, "Not a soul reasoned quietly with me, as my mother used to do, for now I was only one of many little animals driven by a herder." The story traces her growing sense of isolation and disconnection from her family in Yankton. By the end of the story, she describes her triumph at the oratory contest, when she gives that speech side by side. But while she's pleased, largely because the way she describes it, she's pleased less because she won and more because she was triumphant even while that banner of the squaw is like flapping over her head. She's still left in the end feeling somewhat hollow. Quote, "The rest of that night I sat in an armchair, gazing into the crackling fire. I laughed no more in triumph when thus alone. The little taste of victory did not satisfy a hunger in my heart. In my mind I saw my mother, far away on the western plains, and she was holding a charge against me."
In the next story, An Indian Teacher Among Teachers, she further describes this sense of alienation. In her pursuit of white education, she had lost her connection with the earth. She began to see the walls of the Carlisle Indian School as a kind of white-walled prison. Quote, "For the white man's paper, I had given up my faith in the Great Spirit. For these same papers, I had forgotten the healing in trees and brooks. On account of my mother's simple view of life and my lack of any, I gave her up also. Like a slender tree, I had been uprooted from my mother, nature, and God. I was shorn of my branches, which had waved in sympathy and love for home and friends. The natural coat of bark, which had protected my oversensitive nature, was scraped off to the very quick." End quote. These weren't exactly endorsements of the assimilationist policy of boarding schools where Zitkala-Ša worked. Pratt, superintendent of the Carlisle School, was enraged by Zitkala-Ša's disloyalty. Quote, "But for those she maligned," Pratt wrote, referencing the missionaries and teachers in Zitkala-Ša's past, "she would be a poor squaw in an Indian camp, probably married to some no-account Indian." End quote. Still, Zitkala-Ša went on tour with the Carlisle Indian School Band, performing excerpts from the famed Longfellow epic poem Hiawatha while wearing beaded buckskins.
Side note, this is also really interesting to me because Lilydale has clippings showing that both Askinantan and Chinquilla also performed excerpts from Hiawatha on their tours, and sometimes those were set to music. And it's such an interesting example of the dynamic facing many American Indians during that time period, right? They're facing sort of this cultural, linguistic, and literal genocide from oppressors who are at the same time fascinated with the remnants of what they see as a dying culture, right? A culture that's disappearing. And so they pay money to listen to an Indian sing a white man's version of Indians' history and legend while wearing sort of this mishmash of native clothing that is legible to white people, right? Like, it's this weird, like, mirror effect thing that's going on.
It's like so white people can kind of pretend.
Yes.
Like they can pretend, and they have that sort of catharsis, that romantic kind of catharsis about like, these noble savages and, you know, what we've done to them or whatever. Like, it's this weird play acting. It's very strange.
Right. It's also, I think, like a way of casting Indians that still existed as remnants of a bygone era that no longer existed. Right. Mm-hmm. It's also, it's also just interesting to me that there were these patterns, right? That like some Indians are able to sort of catch onto, like, oh, white people like to hear Hiawatha. Well, that's a way for me to make money, right? Like I need money. And so I'll do the thing that they want me to do. It's certainly not just Zitkala-Ša or even Askinantan and Chinquilla. This is a more widespread phenomenon.
Right. It's like a nostalgia thing. Right. Like that nostalgia is really powerful recreationally and also politically, right? Like that we're even now, we're always looking back to this past. People are like, oh, the good old days, back when there was only two genders, blah, blah, blah. All those like gross Christian nationalist people will like use nostalgia to, they're kind of hearkening back to this past that didn't actually exist exactly like they said it did, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah. In 1901, Zitkala-Ša continued her writing career with a story in Harper's Weekly called The Soft-Hearted Sioux. In this fictional story, a teenage Dakota boy returns home to his reservation after years away at a boarding school, changed by his time away. Quote, 9 winters I hunted for the soft heart of Christ and prayed for the huntsman who chased the buffalo on the plains, end quote. He tries to convert his family and tribe, but they reject his attempts and express their disappointment in his rejection of his culture. Insulted by his attempts to convert them, most of the band leaves with the tribal medicine man rejecting Christianity for their ancestral faith, leaving him and his parents behind. His father, sick and hungry, laments that his son is now too soft-hearted to hunt and will allow him to die before he kills a buffalo to keep his family alive. Desperate to prove himself and to keep his ailing father alive, he kills the only thing available, a cow that belongs to a white rancher. In the process of trying to escape, the boy kills the rancher too, only to discover that his father has died while waiting for him to return. In the end, he faces his impending execution at the gallows stoically, wondering whether he will experience a Christian afterlife with a soothing sleep granted by Jesus, or be met by his father, finally proud of his son. The story, while fictional, captures again the reality that Indian children educated in boarding schools were trapped, unable to truly join white society, and unable to be part of life on the reservation.
This story enraged Pratt and the Carlisle camp even more than her earlier essays. All her literary skill was the result of the white people who educated her, a Carlisle publication insisted, not the result of her own merits. Zitkala-Ša wrote to her friend Carlos Montezuma, Yavapai Apache, quote, "I must live my life. I must think in my own way, since I cannot help it. I must write the lessons I see. I have a place in the universe, and no one can cheat or crowd me by a single hair's breadth." Pratt, however, did not have patience to deal with Zitkala-Ša's rebelliousness anymore and dismissed her from the Carlisle Indian School. No longer linked to Carlisle, Zitkala-Ša traveled back to the Dakota Territory, where she hoped to focus on her writing. She spent time interviewing Dakota elders about tribal stories and legends, which she planned to compile into a volume. She had mixed feelings about living with her mother again. Their relationship was, and for the rest of her mother's life, was very strained. She also became reacquainted with Raymond Bonin, the young man she had known at the Quaker school. Also the child of a white father and a Dakota mother, Raymond had a very similar experience to Zitkala-Ša, with the exception that he had been baptized Catholic. The two began riding together and talking together in Dakota. Their relationship was only complicated by the fact that she was also sort of dating her friend from Carlisle, Carlos Montezuma, who was repeatedly begging her to marry him in his letters. And Montezuma was in Chicago, so this was mostly like a pen pal thing, but it was all very complex.
So while juggling her busy dating life, Zitkala-Ša published her book, Old Indian Legends. The book is a collection of legends and stories generally aimed at young readers, but with a strong subtext intended for a wider readership. The stories are translated from the original Dakota language, taken from the oral history she conducted with Dakota elders. In it, stories reflect modern-day realities for Dakota people. Badgers, stand-ins for Indians, are robbed by bears, clearly symbolic of white Americans. Doubleface sings while he tortures babies with thorns. A rabbit gives up his eyes in order to accept a life made easy by technology. The final story, The Warlike Seven, tells the story of 7 warriors: the ashes, the fire, the bladder, the grasshopper, the dragonfly, the fish, and the turtle. They're under attack from different powers even as they try to fight. The wind blows the ashes away, the fire goes out, the bladder is burst by a thorn, the grasshopper is stuck in the mud, the dragonfly dies of sorrow, but the turtle and the fish go on to outwit those who try to kill them. When some villagers tried to kill the fish and the turtle by drowning them, they take to the water happily and then taunt them. "This is where I live. This is where I live."
I tried to find some analysis of this story, and I'm sure that it exists, but I could not find it. So this is just my armchair American Studies creative writing major analysis, okay? But to me, the story seems like a statement about the persistence of the Lakota, Dakota, or Sioux people, of which there are 7 council fires, or tribal groups or bands. The Lakota, Dakota also had a very strong warrior culture. As white Americans encroached, this quote-unquote warlike 7 tried to fight, but some of them fell away. Perhaps for Zitkala-Ša, this meant less that they were eradicated or conquered, because many of those groups don't just disappear off the face of the earth in real life, right? But more that they were forced to give in or to make concessions to the U.S. government. Yet in the end, 2 of them remain, having outwitted these villagers who were certain that they could kill them, right? And perhaps this is the Lakota Dakota continuing to survive, defiant in their ancestral homes, shouting, "This is where I live." Either way, the book was a success, and the publisher wanted her to write more books for them. She did write a couple of more articles published in the Atlantic Monthly, Everybody's Magazine, and Harper's Monthly, which grappled with feminism and religious faith. One essay in particular, entitled "Why I Am a Pagan," was a rebuttal to the criticism she received for her essays about boarding schools. In the essay, she talks about returning to Yankton and considering her faith, questioning the Christian doctrines that she'd been taught at boarding school. She seeks, quote, the loving mystery that encompasses all races. The essay ends, quote, I prefer to their dogma, Christian dogma, my excursions into the natural gardens where the voice of the Great Spirit is heard in the tittering of birds, the rippling of mighty waters, and the sweet breathing of flowers. If this is paganism, then at present at least, I am a pagan. Here, I don't interpret Zitkala-Ša as rejecting God or religion, really, or even Christianity, actually, but instead describing something bigger. This has sometimes been interpreted as maybe a bad faith argument, maybe even a lie, this essay, because of some decisions that Zitkala-Ša makes later in her life that we'll get to in a second. But I don't agree with that interpretation. I see her here as sort of thinking about spirituality very broadly.
While the press hoped she would write more books, Zitkala-Ša stepped away from writing in her mid-20s. In 1902, she married her old friend Raymond Bonin, who took a job working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, posted at the Uinta and Ouray Reservation in Utah. Life there was hard. As Yankton, Dakota, the Bonins were cultural strangers, trapped between the white American agency leadership and the Ute tribe. From this point, Zitkala-Ša's work became more explicitly political than literary, focused on intertribal organization and cooperation for Indian rights. In 1903, she gave birth to her son and only child, Raymond Oya Bonin, who the couple called Ohia. They also take in another child, an orphan Ute boy named Orrin, and an elderly Dakota man known as Old Sioux. Raymond's work in Utah was incredibly challenging. The Episcopal Church sent a mission to the territory that quickly tried to control the running of the government school. With their quick rise to control, Raymond took a job with the Episcopal school, but white employees resented working under an Indian man. Frustrated, Raymond quit and the family moved back to Dakota Territory, this time to the Standing Rock Reservation, where Zitkala-Ša took up work as a clerk. It was during this time that the couple met several Catholic nuns and priests working on the reservation, helping to host large gatherings known as Sioux Congresses. One priest, Father Martin Kennel, became a close friend and spiritual advisor, and soon Zitkala-Ša converted to Catholicism.
Now, this is what could easily be construed as Zitkala-Ša being hypocritical or false in her defenses of pagan, quote-unquote, pagan Indian religions and a rejection of Christianity that we saw in that earlier essay, right? I don't see it that way. As Tadeusz Lewandowski points out, Catholics tended to be more progressive in their methods of missionizing, allowing for generous overlap between native cultural practices and religious traditions and Catholic teaching, and they also were powerful in their criticisms of federal Indian policies. On the Dakota-Lakota reservations, the organization of congresses, or these sort of big gatherings basically, helped to replace the banned tribal dances, such as the Sun Dance, that had brought the various bands of the Lakota together periodically. It's true that these congresses were still Catholic events with catechism, the Eucharist, and homilies, but at least they worked with existing cultural practices instead of trying to entirely stamp those cultural practices out. Speaking of cultural practices, I am such a bad former Catholic that I had to Google Eucharist. I was like, communion in Catholic Church, because I was like, I know it has a weird name. I couldn't remember. So yeah, my grandma would be so disappointed in me. Anyway, as we discussed in previous episodes, there's also a very long history of Indians and Catholics finding common ground in ritual, although within limits.
Her new religious practice did not take away Zitkala-Ša's devotion to preserving Indian culture, though it did create some strange tensions. The Bonins moved back to Utah in 1910, and in a series of letters to Father Martin, she expressed the need for a Catholic church on the reservation, because the Utes had no active Christian presence and did not observe the Sabbath, but did perform their traditional dances. In the letter, she didn't explicitly condemn the dances, but rather the lack of a Catholic church to supplement. She clearly didn't completely reject the dances, because later that year, Zitkala-Ša met William Hanson, a Mormon music teacher and former missionary from Brigham Young University, at a Sun Dance gathering. The two discussed their shared passion for music and interest in the Sun Dance at length, and soon Zitkala-Ša raised the possibility of combining their musical, literary, and cultural talents to write an opera based on the Sun Dance. Though it might seem surprising, opera was not an uncommon art form for Native people in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Askinantan, the Mohawk, who lived for a time in Lilydale, was an incredibly talented and classically trained opera singer, and Chinquilla was famous for performing operatic pieces. Several operas of the 1910s featured storylines about indigenous people such as Poya, Natoma, and La Fanchula de West. All of these operas, however, were more about white people's imaginings of Native peoples and cultures, not depictions of actual cultural practices, and almost never featured Native American performers. Some, like Puccini's La Fanchula de West, featured harmful stereotypes. The Sundance Opera, when it debuted in 1913, was very different.
The opera was named for the sacred ritual of the Sundance, a ceremony practiced across the Great Plains. A central group of dancers perform the ceremony while others watch on. Dancers prepare rigorously for the ceremony, fasting and refusing water for days. Sometimes the ceremony involves other events, such as a hunt, a military raid, or time spent in a sweat lodge. But the central experience is a dance that takes place within the hoop, or the sacred circle. In Lakota Dakota ceremonies, the dancers are pierced with hooks and tethers, sometimes dragging a buffalo skull, other times anchored to a sacred tree. The dancer pulls against this tether until either the tether breaks or the flesh rips. The physical commitment is understood as a sacrifice committed on behalf of the community, heightening the dancer's spiritual connections and resulting in answered prayers. It's unsurprising that many white Christian Americans saw this as grotesque, barbaric, and potentially dangerous. Many whites, in fact, saw dances as proof that Indians were resisting assimilation and Christianization, and often saw them as precursors to violence against whites. Similar dances, such as the one central to the ghost dance religion, had resulted in harsh crackdowns from the U.S. Army, and dances were tightly regulated and banned on many reservations. In 1881, the Sun Dance was banned on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and in 1883, it was federally banned. The following year, all Indian religious practices, had been banned by the federal government, which is pretty incredible when you think about it. But nevertheless, dances persisted, adapted, and changed to survive. So the opera is being written and performed at a time when the Sundance, when it is appearing, is happening in direct violation of the federal government, right, in federal law. So it's an opera about something that is incredibly contested. The opera is set near the Yankton Reservation and focuses on a love triangle between the hero, the Dakota Ohia, obviously named after Zitkala-Sha's son, a princess, the daughter of a Ute chief, Winona, and a Shoshone man named Sweet Singer. Ohia decides to earn Winona by taking part in the Sundance ceremony, while Sweet Singer tries to win over the chief with gifts to earn his daughter. In the end, Ohia is triumphant, successfully completing the dance, and Sweet Singer very conveniently drops dead. It's a fascinating and very Indian story, one that features different tribes coming together in this shared ceremony. As a side note, the opera is still revived from time to time, and I'll try to embed one or two of the videos that I've been able to find of either performances from performances of music from the show, or of people. There's like a little documentary. One of the documentaries, unfortunately, is in German, but it could still be useful.
So the time commitment that Zitkala-Ša put into the opera, on top of the difficulties of keeping themselves afloat in the frustrating Bureau of Indian Affairs, put strain on the Bonin marriage. Zitkala-Ša had a renewed desire for her own professional pursuits and wanted to ensure that her son, Ohia, received a Catholic education, which wasn't necessarily available in the agency towns where the Bonins lived. In summer of 1913, she took back up with her correspondence with her former lover, Carlos Montezuma, and not long after wrote to one of her priest confidants that a private family misunderstanding had resulted in charges of domestic violence against Raymond, which in turn infuriated the BIA, who saw Raymond as a liability. The altercation, Zitkala-Ša wrote to the priest, was the result of Raymond's jealousy. Perhaps he had found her letters to his old rival, Montezuma. Things did eventually settle, and the couple remained married.
Her experience with the opera, and perhaps her years supporting Raymond's career in the BIA, and with her son now away in a Catholic boarding school, Zitkala-Ša now threw her energy into the burgeoning Indian rights movement. In 1914, she joined the advisory board of the Society of American Indians, an organization focused on pan-Indian organizing and activism. And just to be clear, pan-Indian organizing, I mean like intertribal, right? Like it's sort of a movement to try to connect all tribes in sort of one focused organization to achieve rights for all Indians rather than just like focusing on the tribal level. At the SAI conference in 1915 in Lawrence, Kansas, Zitkala-Ša presented a paper describing her work doing community organizing for women at the Fort Duquesne Agency in Utah. Her work introduced her to Indians from all around the country, including Arthur C. Parker, a Seneca, who was related to the former commissioner of the BIA, and U.S. Army officer Elias Parker, who was born on the Cattaraugus Reservation just down the road from Buffalo, New York, and very close to Lilydale. Parker encouraged her to write again and helped her to publish a lengthy poem in American Indian Magazine, which was the publication of the SAI. During this period, Zitkala-Ša also began a new campaign against a new religious trend that had recently appeared among the Utes, peyote.
Peyote, derived from cacti, was a drug that was popularized as part of a religious ceremony in the 19th century by Quanah Parker, who was Comanche, and John Wilson, who was Delaware Caddo. Peyote was immediately criticized by white Americans, and many Christian Indians agreed with their condemnation, including several members of the SAI and another organization, the Indian Rights Association, or IRA. Peyote, the IRA argued, brought out the baser passions of Indians and caused them to, quote, reject the teachings of the church. The response was not unlike a moral panic. Zitkala-Ša even wrote one letter that sounded an awful lot like, "But think of the children," claiming that children were suffering at school because their parents were keeping them out at peyote ceremonies. Here again, we see her torn between worlds. Advocates of peyotism saw it as a pan-Indian syncretic faith combining aspects of Christianity and Native American practices, but critics saw it as a dangerous drug use at odds with Christianity. Zitkala-Ša put her literary talents to work in criticizing peyote in a story called Chipeta, Widow of Chief Ore, with a word about a deal in blankets. This interestingly named story told the story of Chipeta and her husband, Chief Ore, who had been strong leaders of their people in dealings with white people. But then after Ore's death, Chipeta began using peyote, and she was then convinced by whites to trade over 250,000 acres of land in exchange for 2 shawls. The story was a bad faith rendering of the real story of a Ute woman named Chipeta, who Zitkala-Ša had met not long before. According to Tadeusz Lewandowski, Chipeta was actually a woman of keen political shrewdness who was a harsh critic of federal government. Zitkala-Ša saw peyote and nothing else as the reason for the Utes' land loss.
In 1918, Zitkala-Ša actually appeared before Congress to testify against peyote use. Dismissing the religious freedom argument made by peyote supporters, she stated that peyote, quote, is used in a way which outrages decency and induces intoxication and degeneracy. Here, she made a powerful enemy, the ethnographer James Mooney, who had studied peyoteism for decades. Now, weird coincidence here, Mooney had actually grown up in Richmond, Indiana, where Zitkala-Ša had attended college at Earlham. Isn't that wild? Like, a lot of his early studying, like, he just like hung out in the Earlham library. It's just really interesting to me that they're like very much like ships in the night, right? They're kind of like living in these same worlds. Sharp listeners might recall that James Mooney was the ethnographer who interviewed Wovaka, the ghost dance prophet, and wrote the definitive study on the ghost dance religion. We talked about him in our ghost dance episode. Based on his extensive ethnographic study, Mooney believed that peyote was a religious sacrament. Mooney testified, quote, "The Indians are now largely civilized. They are educated and they travel about and take an interest in each other. The result is that the young men, not the older, uncivilized ones, but the younger, middle-aged, and educated men have taken up the peyote cult and organized it as a regular religion, beyond what they knew before among various tribes. In some tribes, they have their own church houses built at their own expense. Because this religion was formalized, structured and created by educated Indians, Mooney now deemed it as quote unquote real, right, and worthy of recognition. Mooney saw peyoteism as a step forward rather than a step away from assimilation.
Mooney attacked Zitkala-Ša for her opposition to the drug, questioning whether she was even really an Indian. He referred to a recent article about her in which the journalist had bungled several facts about her biography. The article, Mooney said, quote, is accompanied by a picture of the author who claims to be a Sioux woman in Indian costume. The dress is a woman's dress from a southern tribe, as shown by the long fringes. The belt is Navajo man's belt. The fan is a peyote man's fan, carried only by men, usually in the peyote ceremony, end quote. Zitkala-Ša, on the other hand, questioned what authority a white ethnographer had over Indian cultures when the events he observed were staged for his benefit. Lewandowski summed up her position. Quote, only someone in close contact with reservation life, such as herself, could accurately judge peyote's influence, end quote. She went on to testify about things she had witnessed, such as how a man named Lone Bear sold fake peyote permits for exorbitant prices and used the religion to dupe others into taking the drug as a miracle cure. She also claimed it had killed dozens of Utes.
Again, this can really look like Zitkala-Ša was making anti-Indian assimilationist arguments in her quest against peyote. But her arguments never referenced Catholicism, right? She wasn't like using it as a way to sort of sell Catholicism. And she didn't make assimilationist arguments suggesting that peyote stood in the way of Indian progress. Instead, she seemed to suggest that peyote itself was an outside influence, something that was preying on the trauma and desperation of Indians. She was worried that the drug would threaten traditional Dakota culture and exacerbate the problems facing Indians. When it was issued, the Congressional Report on Peyote took Zitkala-Ša's testimony very seriously and dismissed Mooney almost entirely, urging Congress to ban peyote on the federal level. Ultimately, no law was passed in 1918, and Mooney went from sort of testifying straight to the believers to help them establish the Native American church, a very formalized church that used peyote as a sacrament in hopes of protecting the drug from bans under sort of freedom of religion. But despite his strategy, Zitkala-Ša and her allies in the Catholic Church helped to get James Mooney banned from performing ethnographic work in the Oklahoma reservation, which was where a lot of this peyote use had sort of originated, and helped to push through an anti-peyote law in South Dakota. While the drug was never outright banned on the federal level, between the late 19th century and the first quarter of the 20th century, peyote was criminalized on the state level, and drug use in the Native American church remains legally very thorny. And here's where we could go into like a real side quest about the sort of, there's some current legal things happening instigated by a man who claims to be James Mooney's Native American son, who is trying to sort of get all sorts of drugs legalized within his own church that he invented. It's incredibly complicated and weird. If you are interested, I'm begging you to Google it. We don't have time to talk about it right now. It was a rabbit hole that I went down for a long time when I was writing the chapter, and I eventually was like, I can't put this in this chapter.
Yeah, I gotta cut it off.
It's too much.
So Zitkala-Ša then turned her attention to greater Indian civil rights, focused in particular on the promise of U.S. citizenship and, radically, the abolition of the United States Indian Bureau. World War I had been galvanizing. Increased surveillance of critical speech made some of her writing, especially her story, A Sioux Woman's Love for Her Grandchild, which was explicitly anti-U.S. military, dangerous. When a draft was instituted in 1917, the exemption for non-citizens, including Native Americans, was soon waived to encourage as much enlistment as possible, and Indian men responded positively, enlisting in relatively large numbers. War service meant a solid paycheck and allowed for the channeling of an otherwise suppressed warrior culture. The Society of American Indians and Zitkala-Ša were enraged, though, when the U.S. military decided that Native American men would have to serve in segregated units. Zitkala-Ša saw this as a way of turning Indian men into cannon fodder, easily placed in the most dangerous positions and therefore quickly annihilated. The Army soon backed away from this policy, though, and American Indian men were allowed to enlist to fight alongside whites. Both Arthur C. Parker and Raymond Bonnin enlisted, seeing the war as an opportunity to prove their masculinity and honor.
Internal squabbles about leadership and actions to prioritize weakened the Society of American Indians during the war years. Members like Zitkala-Ša, Raymond Bonnin, and Carlos Montezuma were becoming more radical than much of the rest of the membership. For instance, in 1918, Montezuma gave a speech entitled, quote, "Abolish the Indian Bureau," that energized some members, more radical members, and upset many other members, many of whom still worked for the government agency and didn't relish the thought of losing their positions. To spread her message of Native American equality and the need for citizenship, which is sort of her new thing during this time period, she worked with the General Federation of Women's Clubs, who helped her to go on a speaking tour. While Zitkala-Ša had been working for what might be labeled progressive reforms for years, this is when we see her align with mainstream white capital P progressives, and with the types of women activists that Elizabeth's book examines. She used Raymond's military service as further evidence for the need for Indian civil rights in a way that many Black Americans did after the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. Quote, "If the Indian is good enough to fight for America, he is good enough to be considered American." Her writing was far more powerful than her speeches, though, and she continued to write essays and stories for various publications criticizing the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the federal government, and insisting on Native American political equality. In one essay entitled "America, Home of the Red Man," she wrote about being called a foreigner by a white man on a train. Reflecting on that word, she then sort of thinks about Indian men wearing the uniform of the United States, marching into battle, and Native American mothers volunteering for the Red Cross. The white man doesn't listen to her when she tries to explain this to him, and he just kind of walks away, rendering Zitkala-Ša, and therefore the sacrifices of American Indians on behalf of the United States, invisible.
Soon after the war, the SAI started to fall apart, and Zitkala-Ša's old friend and former lover, Carlos Montezuma, passed away from tuberculosis. Around the same time, undaunted by the splintering of this group that has been so important to her political life, she published another book, American Indian Stories. Stories from this and from old Indian legends made their way into classrooms and textbooks, and Zitkala-Ša traveled around the country speaking to schools and lecturing on Native American culture. American Indian Stories included her autobiographical essays from early in her life, plus many of her other essays, such as The Soft-Hearted Sioux, followed by new essays that traced an arc of increasing criticism of the policy of cultural assimilation. The story Blue Star Woman argues that the real power in America to fight assimilation and corrupt agencies like the BIA comes from women. Here, Zitkala-Ša was making an explicit plea to the General Federation of Women's Clubs, stating, quote, "Now the time is at hand when the American Indian shall have his day in court through the help of the women of America." In 1921, she gave a speech at the GFWC's biannual conference rallying against the paternalism of the BIA. The organization responded by creating a National Indian Welfare Committee, which would investigate reservation management and work in Washington on behalf of Native Americans. Apparently, Zitkala-Ša wept and declared, quote, "It has begun. Nothing can stop it. We shall have help." End quote.
With the help of the GFWC, Zitkala-Ša published a pamphlet called Americanize the First American, which lays out the failings of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and contrasts them with the progressive reforms that she wanted from Washington. For instance, she hoped for an Indian Citizens Association and a reservation executive committee to replace the BIA in overseeing programs that would aid Indian farmers and teach them modern agricultural practices, and financial programs that would spur business. Again, it might be easy to understand this as simply an assimilationist project, but Americanize the American Indian laid out what sounded very much like progressive reform, while also underscoring the need to preserve Native American cultures and religions. The way to earn these things, Zitkala-Ša argued, was through United States citizenship, which Tadeusz Lewandowski suggests Zitkala-Ša equated to self-protection and sovereignty. So she sees citizenship not as selling out, but as a way of ensuring self-protection and sovereignty.
Her work with the GWFC took her all around the United States. Between 1921 and 1927, she gave hundreds of public lectures. Meanwhile, Raymond went to George Washington University Law School and became a legal clerk, then began representing Indians in claims before the Congressional Committee on Indian Affairs. The 1920s were a particularly perilous time for Indian rights in the United States, especially as the Osage were targeted for their oil wealth, the subject of the recent movie Killers of the Flower Moon. Zitkala-Ša, together with several other activists, traveled to Oklahoma in 1923 to investigate the state's mistreatment of its many Native residents. The results were published in a pamphlet called Oklahoma's Poor Rich Indians, an orgy of graft and exploitation of the 5 civilized tribes legalized robbery, published in 1924. They discovered a horrific culture of exploitation in the state. For example, it was common for guardians to seek out an Indian who had a claim to land, declare them incompetent, and name themselves guardian, and then extort money out of them. Others, such as lawyers, squeezed desperate Indians for money they didn't have for services that were never rendered.
Congress did investigate the situation in Oklahoma, but almost entirely dismissed the evidence that had been gathered by the Indian activists in their time in the state. Influenced by Oklahoma Congressman Charles D. Carter, who wanted to preserve the reputation of the state, the investigations went nowhere. Chairman of the investigation, the congressional investigation, Homer P. Snyder, outright rejected Zitkala-Ša's pamphlet, saying, quote, "We do not want hearsay evidence. We do not want long stories or legends about Indian law or anything of that sort." This was clearly a dig at her history of writing books about the stories central to Dakota culture.
The Oklahoma investigations may not have led to much success, but in January 1924, another congressional act offered what many American Indians had lobbied long and hard for: American citizenship. Not only were American Indians provided citizenship in the bill also declared that said citizenship could not affect tribal status. The Oklahoma investigations raised Zitkala-Ša's national profile even further. With Raymond now a lawyer, it's not clear whether he was ever admitted to the bar exactly, but he's referred to as a lawyer. The couple began to undertake legal challenges to treaty violations. And in 1926, Zitkala-Ša and Raymond founded a new national organization to replace the Society of American Indians, and this was called the National Council of American Indians, the NCAI. Zitkala-Ša served as its president, and Raymond served as its secretary, treasurer, and legal counsel, which is badass of him. The aim of the NCAI was legal rights and protections. She described their mission thusly. Quote, "A time there was when the protest of our race against injustice was voiced in the war cries that rose from the primeval forests. No less audibly, this protest rebounds through the hills and dale of our fatherland, echoing the far-carrying appeals of justice and reason, never to be silenced until the pledge of the nation, made to us by the great-grandfather and sealed by our blood on the field of France, is redeemed." End quote. To quote Tadeusz Lewandowski here, he says, quote, "The formal statement of opposition to decades of federal policy contained the hallmarks of a red power ideology, rooted in organization, racial pride, assertion of rights, and determination to gain freedom and recognition."
The NCIA launched programs designed to investigate conditions on reservations, to educate Indian voters, and to circulate information. The NCIA also established tribal lodges that acted as headquarters of the organization across numerous reservations. They also continued their quest to abolish the BIA. When the BIA was granted extra emergency powers during the beginning of the Great Depression, the NCIA accused superintendents of starving their Indian charges, misappropriating funds, and administering physical punishments. In 1933, a new commissioner of the Bureau, John Collier, who had worked for the GFWC alongside Zitkala-Ša on that Indian Welfare Committee, and who was a tried and true ally for Indian rights, helped push through the Wheeler-Howard Act, colloquially known as the Indian New Deal. This law superseded the Dawes Act, which had subdivided reservation land into allotments and returned much tribal land to its ancestral owners, who would then oversee distribution among tribal members. It wasn't necessarily handed out for free, but at least it was sort of overseen by tribes themselves. The law also listed the federal bans on traditional religious practices such as the sun dance. It required that Indians be appointed to the upper echelons of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and that Native American children would attend day schools on their home reservations.
While this was undoubtedly an improvement, it wasn't enough for Zitkala-Ša, and tensions grew between her and Collier. He hadn't fully abolished the BIA, and the law still allowed authorities in Washington to intervene in sovereign tribal governments. When the Yankton went to create a new constitution and form a tribal government, it was written by Zitkala-Ša and Raymond, but did not meet the expectations of the BIA. Their constitution created a tribal council that had the power of veto over the Secretary of the Interior and over local reservation projects, rather than Washington. It also allowed for voting rights to all Yankton tribal members, even those who did not live on the reservation. This was unacceptable to the BIA, and the Yankton Reservation remained categorized as a sub-agency rather than an independent tribal government until 1963.
Zitkala-Ša died in 1938 of kidney and heart disease. Her final diaries revealed that the end of her life was difficult and stressful as she tried to help her son, Ohia, raise his children as he himself suffered from uncontrolled diabetes. The year she died, her old collaborator, William Hanson, staged a revival of the Sundance Opera, but did not involve Zitkala-Ša or even name her as a collaborator, instead claiming the credit for the work all himself. The NCIA limped along until Raymond Bonin died in 1942, leaving no plan for transition of power to new leadership. In the years after, Zitkala-Ša's legacy was mixed. Some later activists interpreted her work as too assimilationist, even conservative. For instance, her patriotism during World War I and fight for citizenship and voting rights may have seemed like giving in to a colonizing power. But more modern scholars like David Meyer-Turman, Sianina Loma-Waima, and Philip Deloria argue that this was a, quote, strategic necessity, a move towards sovereignty rather than wardship, in which tribes were treated like wards, not constituents of the federal government. Even the NCIA, which died with the Bonins, helped lead to later pan-Indian movements, particularly the National Congress of American Indians, a new NCAI, I guess it is, which was modeled on the earlier NCIA and continues to this day to be a powerful advocate for Indian rights. Zitkala-Ša presaged the later 20th century Red Power movement, the pan-Indian civil rights movement spearheaded by the Yankton scholar Vine Deloria. Zitkala-Ša, her biographer Tadeusz Lewandowski points out, was, quote, a woman whose culture, nation, and identity had been violently marginalized, yet, quote, fought the dispossession of Indians with every tool of white society that she had mastered. She was politically savvy, used her networks and her connections, and had no fear of publicly calling out people in positions of power when they failed to effect change, even when it might make for interpersonal friction or draw the ire of powerful, even dangerous people.
The end.
The end. I really struggled with how to finish this, partly because this was very long, but also because I wasn't sure kind of how to tack anything else onto the end of it that made it, that sort of improved upon how Tadeusz Lewandowski told this story, right? And sort of framed her at the end as a precursor or a a trailblazer for the later Red Power movement. She is truly one of the most incredible women that I've ever read about. Incredibly multifaceted and complex. And it probably shouldn't be, but it is sort of surprising to me that we don't hear more about her, especially within Gilded Age progressive era history, right? She was truly a progressive.
Right. Yeah, a lot of her stances did really seem like a very Gilded Age progressive era sort of stance.
Yeah. And so I know I'm going to be incorporating her for sure into my women's history class, but maybe even when I teach the U.S. History 2 class and I talk a lot about the Gilded Age and then progressive era reforms, I think I'm going to try to find a way to squeeze her in there as well, because I just think more people should know about her. Mm-hmm. And
agreed.
She was awesome, and she was so beautiful.
And she seemed like she was a good writer, and even just literarily, it seems like she should be better known, you know?
Yes. Yeah. Her work is beautifully written. I highly recommend it. I had to read a lot of it for this, and I tried to link it throughout the show notes. So definitely click through there and take a look at some of her writing. Most of it is publicly available, like online, or through what's that? Hathi Trust, digitized. And some of it isn't, but a lot of it is. So I would definitely recommend seeking it out, or going to the library, or ordering a copy of her books of Indian legends. They're also really powerful. Well, thank you for sticking through this very long thing.
Thanks for joining us today, everybody. We invite you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram at dig_history, or join our Facebook group, Dig History Pod Squad, for all kinds of memes and historian hijinks. If you have a comment or question or want to share some kind of words with us, you can always email us at hello@digpodcast.org. We love listener mail. If you're an educator, we've got a compendium of episodes you can use in the classroom and free teaching resources, including full lesson plans, on our website, digpodcast.org. You'll also find full bibliographies, the scripts for all of our episodes, resources, and a link to our swag store at digpodcast.org.
Bye.
Bye.
Indians were resisting assimilation.
To perform a piano. Oh my God, piano. What the f? I know how to talk, I swear. Paisano. Okay.
Peyote from Hiawatha. I almost said ayahuasca.
Even a clown has to dress differently from his usual. Oh my God.
I'm not sure if it's bonin or
I would assume it's bonin, since two N's usually softens.
I think it's bonin.
And plus bonin is too sexual.
Is too sexual. Raised culture. I was distracted because I was thinking, oh, that sounds an awful lot like that kicker's commencement speech. Apparently, that's what we're supposed to do today, too.